On the Autocar show today, the Ducati 959 Panigale, the BMW 3 Series takes on the Mercedes C250D, and meet the Super Nano.
Now this little red hot number that's been seen around Ducati showrooms in India is the 959 Panigale, which is the baby superbike from Bologna. And what makes it really interesting for India specifically is that Ducati insists that this motorcycle is meant to be at home on the street as well as on the racetrack. Well, does that mean this baby superbike, the Panigale 959, isn't all that serious? Well, to find out, we went to Thailand. And our test location was the Chang circuit in Thailand. This 4.5 kilometer racetrack has already hosted a round of WSBK and seems to be all set to welcome MotoGP as well. And waiting there to be tested on this fast, tricky and intricate track was Ducati's new 959 Panigale. Well, the baby Panigale, it's got its fair share of genes from the family, and it's quite apparent, isn't it? Except for those awkward looking exhausts which help the 959 meet new noise emission regulations, it looks gorgeous and familiar. And it should, because the 959 wears the same clothes as the 1299 Panigale, which means it is simple, classy and very, very red. But compared to the bigger Panigale, it is slightly shorter in length and has a slightly smaller wheelbase. It is an incredibly tight and slim package, and it just doesn't feel like a liter class motorcycle. Now Ducati's asked a lot of the 959. It's had to look and feel like a Ducati to ride, but at the same time it's also got to be very affordable, by Ducati standards of course, which is why a few cuts have been made. Yes, for instance, the 959 doesn't have a full LED headlamp, and the swing arm isn't a single-sided unit. And as you can see, the display is a simple LCD unit, not a color screen one like on the 1299. And well, some cutbacks are a bit more serious. The 959 boasts of fully adjustable shower forks at the front and a Sachs monoshock at the rear, but these aren't electronically adjustable like on the 1299. And the Brembo brakes are monoblocks, but they aren't the fierce M50 units seen on the bigger Panigale. And there's no inertial measurement unit on this 959, which means there's no cornering ABS either. Now all the Panigales use monocoque chassis, and it's no different here on the 959. In fact, its setup is very similar to the 1299 Panigale, which funnily enough derived its setup from the 899 Panigale. I know it gets a bit confusing, but basically the difference between the 899 and the 959 comes down to this, that the engine casing is a bit different here so that the swing arm could be mounted 4 millimeters lower, and that helps to get a bit more traction out of the rear wheel. Whether it was accelerating down the straights to 260 kilometers an hour and then braking hard into turn 3, or blasting through the super fast turn 4 at 170 kph, the 959 was ultra solid. Even when you flicked it through turns 9 and 10, never did it feel nervous, lazy or out of shape. And the M4 32 Brembo monoblocks may not be cutting edge, but they have plenty of bite and are easy to modulate as well. Basically, this motorcycle inspired a whole load of confidence. Frankly, out on the racetrack, the 959 Panigale was ridiculous because you could miss your braking points, you could turn in too late, you could make a hash of things and you'd still be able to get away with it because the chassis offers so much composure, because the Pirelli Diablo Super Corsas offer so much grip that it just inspires confidence and lets you do what you want and get away with mistakes even. The only trade-off I think is that at corner entry it's not as quick in terms of the turn-in as I'd expected. for it to be really quick, you have to muscle it, sweat it out a bit, and when you do, it'll do everything you want it to. And when you master this, I can see the 1299 carat dangling in front of me already. But in the meantime, to master the 959, you have to get to terms with the engine as well, which is quite an interesting setup. Now, the 959 has more displacement, more power, 157 horsepower, and it has more torque as well, 107 Newton meters. But the real reason for the bump up in displacement was to help the Ducati meet new emission norms. But a side effect to all of that is that the engine is just so friendly to use. The hydraulically operated clutch is light, the gear shifts are smooth, and the power delivery, well, the Super Quadro motor makes more torque in the mid-range. From 5000 RPM, there's a lot more zing on offer. And revving the engine to its near 11,500 RPM redline is lots of fun. But it doesn't feel like power is stacked right at the top. So, when you're riding hard and fast, it doesn't feel all that intimidating. Thanks to the Ducati quick shifter, making full bore gear shifts is super easy as well. Thanks to the inclusion of a slipper clutch, it's really easy to slam down the gearbox when entering into corners and have the rear end just stay in line. This makes the Panigale neater still to ride, and the safety net is cast wider still. Yes, the 959 is seriously quick, but you soon realize it won't overwhelm you. Well, there's a lot of electronics on the 959 to make it safer. You have 8 levels of traction control. You have 3 levels of engine brake control. You have 3 levels of anti-lock braking system control. And of course, you have rider modes, 3 of them. Race mode is the sportiest with the crispest throttle response for all 157 horses. And the traction control just becomes a bit more easygoing, as does the ABS. And then there is the sport mode, which is what you'd end up using out on the street, which gives you all 157 horses, but the throttle response is a bit more mild. And of course, the electronic nannies are a bit more active. Unless of course it's raining, which is when you'd want to use the rain mode, which caps power to 100 and throttle response becomes really soft and the electronic nannies become hyper. By superbike standards, the 959 should be reasonably usable in everyday conditions. For instance, even though the suspension had been firmed up for track use, it felt quite supple. And yes, the seating position is sporty, but it isn't overly aggressive either. And the service intervals are quite long. Valve clearance inspections are required every 24,000 kilometers, while a general service is required every 12,000 kilometers or 12 months. Yes, it isn't as feature-loaded as a 1299, but when you see the price, which is around 14 lakh rupees ex-showroom, the 959 seems like a very attractive package. So what's it going to be like to hop onto a 959 Panigale in a showroom in India and ride out onto Indian streets? I'm not going to stick my neck out, but from whatever little bit I've experienced, I think it will be a motorcycle that will be fairly decent to live with, at least by superbike standards. But where I will stick my neck out and say is that as a sports bike, this is a pakka sport bike. It's got solid performance, just happens to be easy to get to terms with. It's got a chassis that just instills confidence. It's got electronics that really cast a wide safety net for people to get onto a motorcycle and experience sport bike riding with. And along with that, of course, you get a price tag which makes it all the more attractive. It sits in the sweet spot. It's right between Trans Daytona 6 and 5R on one hand, and of course, the Japanese liter class bikes which have a lot more power, of course. But this package, just the way everything comes together, the power, the accessibility, the price tag, and of course its exotic flavor, in my books, makes the Ducati 995 Panigale a particularly attractive sport bike.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. You're having a bout of deja vu, and we've seen this before, right? Me standing next to a BMW 3 Series and a Mercedes C-Class and trying to pick a winner. Well, you're right, we have done this before, but this time things are a little different. BMW recently gave the 3 Series a facelift, and Mercedes recently put a new diesel engine into the C-Class. The result is both cars now have a range-topping diesel variant that costs around 45 lakh rupees. These are the cars we have with us today. Let's go see what's what. So, what you see before you is the Mercedes C250D and the BMW 320d M Sport. And both cost roughly 5 lakhs more than their lesser counterparts. Just by looking at them, however, there's hardly any way to tell. The C-Class especially has absolutely no changes on the outside, apart from the fancier, adaptive full LED headlights that the standard car doesn't get. Its smooth regal shape and nice chrome detailing still has a lot of appeal, but we really wish Merc did a bit more to set this 250D apart from the 220D. The BMW 320D does a bit better. It's the M Sport version, so there are more aggressive bumpers and side skirts, as well as larger, sportier wheels. And as ever with the 3 Series, it looks the sportier and more aggressive of the two. But let's leave the exterior for passers-by to admire and head to where you'll be spending most of your time. Now, one of the C-Class's biggest strengths from day one has always been its interior. And even in the company of this updated 3 Series, it still stands out as the much better interior. One thing I'm not a fan of though is the infotainment screen. It's still too small and should have been better integrated into the dash. The BMW, on the other hand, is a very different cup of tea. You're sat really low down, maybe a little bit too low for some shorter people, but it really gives you a sense of feeling connected with the car. The M Sport even gets a fighter jet-like heads-up display as standard, as well as launch control. What's not so nice is that they haven't updated the design in the process, and it's starting to really look a little bit old and generic now. So, not a lot has changed on the inside or the outside of these cars, so perhaps it's best to look at what's under the bonnet. Now you might remember this engine, the 250D, from a number of larger Mercs as well as the previous generation C-Class. It's the twin-turbo version of the existing 2.1-litre 4-cylinder diesel. Now, while it doesn't feel outright ferocious, in fact it's rather linear, you can feel the added punch over the C220D. With 34 horsepower and 100 Nm more than the C220D, it should feel punchier. But the kicker is that it has 14 horsepower and 100 Nm more than the Beamer too. What really helps things though is the new 9G-tronic 9-speed automatic gearbox. It is really super responsive and quick to react. Where in other gearboxes 9 speeds might seem like a bit too much and the gearbox fumbles around in tricky situations, in this one it seems quite prudent in its gear selection. When you're going up an incline and you suddenly ask for a burst of acceleration, for example, it won't fumble through the gears. It'll pick the right one and stick to it till you clear the incline and make smooth progress. It's really quite intelligent. So it's looking pretty good for the Merc, but amazingly, even though it's down on power, it's the BMW that's half a second quicker to 100 km an hour. And though on paper the engine might seem the same as before, it isn't. Now this is a BMW 320D, so it gets a 2-litre diesel engine, right? You may not know this, but this is actually an all-new 2-litre diesel engine. It has the same cubic capacity as before, but power has gone up ever so slightly from around 184 horsepower to 189 horsepower. The thing is, however, though it is more refined than before, it's still not as refined as the Mercedes. Though power comes in a more linear manner than before, it's still not delivered as cleanly as the Merc, and it still hands out bursts of torque, making it a little less easy to drive. Another area where the BMW falls short of the Mercedes is in its gearbox. The 8-speed ZF unit is not as quick to respond as the brand new Mercedes 9-speed unit, and as a result it's a little bit hesitant off the line, so you can't make progress as quickly as you probably would have liked to. The peaky power delivery and sometimes fumbly gearbox mean the 320D isn't as good as the Merc at slow city speeds, but is instead at its best when you're pushing it as hard as possible. Speaking of which, But where BMW is still truly the master is in the handling department. This steering is just so well calibrated. This car doesn't have adjustable suspension, but it feels like it does. Because when you dial through the various drive modes, the steering weighs up so progressively and it gives you so much confidence, it feels like the whole dynamic of the car has completely changed. It's just brilliant. And then there's the body control. You can fling this car mercilessly into a hard corner and it will just adapt so fluidly. No drama, just loads of grip around the corner. It's fantastic. Credit where it's due though, the Mercedes isn't all that bad either. It's actually got sharper, quicker steering and body control is quite decent too. The steering in the C250D is certainly lighter than the one in the BMW, but that's not entirely a bad thing. It's still got enough heft, and the good part is that it's really quick. And that means it really allows you to chuck the C-Class around corners quite easily. But the Merc just doesn't have the same grip or poise of the Beamer, which still rules the roost overall in the fun handling department. Where Mercs traditionally score some points back is with their incredible ride quality, but we were in for a surprise. Now when Mercedes brought the C-Class to India, they had to raise it to deal with our poor roads, and in doing so they also had to stiffen it. The result is a less than stellar ride quality. And that means over slightly rough patches or even bumpy roads, you and your occupants will be tossed around a little bit. The upshot of the firm suspension is that it rides very flat and stays very composed when you're going at high speeds. So that's a bonus if you drive on the highway a lot. But let's face it, most of us will tackle city roads every day, which really aren't the best. Now the 3 Series is clearly the better riding car in this test. It's got a softer suspension setup and that means it absorbs bumps a whole lot better. The best part is that it's also compliant, which means it doesn't bounce you and toss you around the place. And the even better part is that this hasn't come at the cost of handling. This is still an amazing car to drive. Now while I'm back here, I might as well tell you what the seats and space are like. Though both these cars are a bit more rewarding from the driver's seat than their base models, this is India after all, so at some point you will be chauffeur driven. Let's start with the Benz. The back seat of the C-Class really has a lot going for it, most notably the luxurious ambience created by the soft leather and the rich wood. But it's also got this neat little second sunroof, which is great, it's only for the rear passengers. And while there is enough legroom and enough headroom, where it really does suffer is in thigh support on this seat. As you might be able to see, there is not enough of it, and the C-Class loses out to the 3 Series in this respect. When you look at the 3 Series from the outside, it might seem a little low and you might think that there's not a whole lot of room back here, but it couldn't be further from the truth. You see, BMW has very cleverly placed the seat lower and further back, and while that means getting in and out is a little bit more difficult, the end result is that it's a far more comfortable seat. I've got fantastic thigh support, fantastic back support, great headroom, and as much if not more legroom than what you get in the C-Class. So overall, it's a point here and a point there for both these cars. This is definitely going to be a close fight. So once again, as usual with these two, it has come down to the wire. It's so hard to pick a winner. On one hand, you have the BMW, which is amazing to drive, but has also upped its luxury quotient. But then there's the Mercedes, which has a much better engine and gearbox than before. It's important then to look at these cars exactly for what they are, which is top-end diesel variants that cost a bit more than the standard variant. Over the regular car, the 320D M Sport gets you a racy body kit and wheels, a bit more interior flourishes, and a bit more equipment too. The C250D, on the other hand, gets you a much stronger engine and a much better gearbox, as well as a bit more equipment too. So while they are quite closely matched on the driving and being driven in front, when it comes to taking your extra money, that extra mile, it's the Mercedes that does it better, which is why it's the winner of this test.
Tata's Nano has always been a fun and cute little car. But there's nothing cute at all about this Super Nano, which is J Motorsports' version of a fun car. Now, when they say fun, they mean fun with a capital F. That's because in the back there is a 200 horsepower engine. And you can imagine what that'll do in a car of this size. What's apparent right off the bat is that this isn't just a Nano with a bigger engine. It's an unholy alliance between a modified superbike motor and an F3 racing car. The superbike engine has been tuned to deliver in excess of 200 bhp. The original Nano makes just 37. And inside is a tubular chassis, part of which is shared with an F3 car. And the suspension, wheels, brakes, tires all come from there. What I also absolutely love are the Super Nano's completely OTT looks. That wide track is just crazy, the massive wheel arches give it plenty of character, and don't you just love those ducts near the rear window? Starting up isn't as easy as you imagine. The Dragon awakens with the primeval scream, stabs of exhaust spitting from the rear, and the din from the unsilenced exhaust is so loud I can barely hear myself think. And because it's a bike engine, it's also super sensitive to the throttle. The revs just soar as soon as I touch it. Because it has so little torque, it is extremely difficult to get away. While the horsepower is around 200, the torque is only around as much as on a Swift. Acceleration from rest is also a bit disappointing. I'd like to tell you the Super Nano runs away from the line with its tail on fire, but initially there's not much. And that's probably down again to that comparatively low torque figure. What I discover later, of course, is that there's much more power in the top end. This engine makes its maximum power at around 14,000 RPM. But to get there, you have to get it in the power band. At around 6,000 RPM, she starts to pull, and then it goes completely insane at 10,000. Some poke! The rear squats down marginally as I accelerate out of tight corners. The scenery comes rushing at me, and so continuous is the acceleration, it feels like the car is running away. Now many of you must be wondering what 200 horsepower in a Nano can do. Well, take a look at this. What's also pretty unreal is the grip this car generates. I find myself carrying an incredible amount of speed into corners, tapping down on the gearbox as I turn in. And it's only when I'm settled in a corner that I can accelerate out hard. The setup does prefer straight line stability, and it does understeer a bit, with the front wheels losing grip first. But for something that started out life as a Nano, this is simply unreal. I'm sure Ratan Tata never thought of anything like this when he envisioned the original Nano. This is just insanity! Of course, the Super Nano can't be registered. It can't be made road legal, and truth be told, you can't buy one either. But oh, how I'd love to go hunting sports cars late on a Sunday night in one. Wouldn't that be a laugh a minute?